Good afternoon, Anthony. In this podcast, we're diving into the origins of the domestic dog. And I think most listeners will say, well, it came from the wolf, didn't it? And we've got a nuanced take on it. Look forward to discussing that with you.
Yes, well, the domestic dog, so intricately and intimately associated with humanity that it's actually hard for us in Western cultures to look at the dog with scientific objectivity. And so, when one goes into the question of which is the wild ancestor of the domestic dog, or which are the wild ancestors of the domestic dog, that investigation is only partly an objective zoological investigation. It's also partly a psychological investigation of ourselves, because you can't disentangle very easily the psychological influences that bear down on our zoological view of an animal as intimately associated with us as the dog. And so you always have to ask yourself, when scientists come up with any view of where the dog came from, you have to ask yourself, what are the sort of subconscious psychological currents that are swirling around that kind of influence this view and bias it in one direction or another. And then besides that, of course, just the purely scientific part is quite difficult because there's no sure way of testing hypotheses. And you could mount a reasonable case for different viewpoints. But I guess our main feeling is that there's a chance that the main interpretation that's agreed on today, which is that the major ancestor of the domestic dog is the wolf, is actually in error, and that a different species was the main ancestor, for which there's actually a lot of evidence once you get a search image for that idea.
Yeah, I look forward to discussing all that evidence, but I would think most ecologists are going to say, well, don't the DNA studies support the notion that our dog is 99% wolf?
Well, DNA is something, but it's not everything. And furthermore, DNA is not something that the reader of the literature can observe directly. And so one of the problems with DNA is you're always relying on somebody else's interpretation, as opposed to other studies in science, including biology, where you can actually look at the data in a way that allows you to make an independent interpretation. So do we trust geneticists and students of phylogenetics and cladistics? Well, sure, but they're sort of operating in a behind a screen that we can't really examine and cross-question. There's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of technical assumptions in the whole process, and it's hard to say that we can just assume that they're all right about everything all the time. And so the genetic studies are all very well and so on, but that doesn't disqualify different hypothesizing. In fact, the genetic studies should never be the be all and end all of any such decision. There should always be a multiple lines of evidence, including things that you can actually observe. And one of the main things that you can observe in the domestic dog, which has been way underplayed, it's hardly been mentioned, is that many individuals of the domestic dog today retain what is obviously an atavistic or ancestral color pattern that is completely absent from the wolf, and that remains widespread in many different breeds of dogs with such consistency and clarity that it's almost proof that the dog was largely derived from some species other than the wolf. And so on the left hand, you have all the technically impressive and professionally weighty genetic opinion. On the right hand, you've got what you can see for yourself every time you go to the doggy beach or around the park, which is these magnificent throwbacks in the form of kelpies and other breeds to an obviously symmetrical wild type pattern that has to have come from somewhere. And there's nothing in the wolf that suggests it came from the wolf. So where did it come from? That's the basic problem.
Yeah. And as far as the DNA analyses go, I think there's a general consensus that they aren't black and white. It's not as if the interpretation is purely objective. There is subjectivity in assessing the code, from what I understand. Not having been in the lab and looking at the DNA code myself, but I hear from colleagues that their judgment calls and their subjectivity in interpreting the code. So I think that's what's potentially holding back a open discussion about these other hypotheses, in that the large majority of society, dog lovers, will think that the DNA studies are black and white. And so is that the first stumbling block preventing people from thinking about other options?
Well, that is exactly right. So a balanced view is that the DNA work is intriguing, important, and weighty, but it's not the be all and end all. We should have a kind of a conceptual framework in which we take the DNA analyses seriously, but we also have at least 4 other categories of evidence that we insist on attending to.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. You see, it's almost like we've been browbeaten by this wonderful whiz-bangery of genetics, to the point that we've lost our common sense in other departments of thinking.
Right. Okay. So having broken down that barrier, we can explore the black and tan coloration a bit more, or do you want to look at other strands of evidence as well?
Well, I don't know in which order we should attend to it, but maybe let's just rehash very briefly some of the other objections to the idea that the wolf has been the sole or main ancestor of the domestic dog. And many listeners will be familiar with these objections. For example, one objection is that it's implausible that the wolf was domesticated 30,000 years ago by the kind of process that we can envisage, and that we can kind of rationalize in the domestic cat. So, for example, in the domestic cat, it's very easy to imagine how it became domesticated. Human beings grew plants and stored seeds and other products of the plants, and this attracted rodents, and the rodents attracted the wild felid towards the encampment or the settlement because the prey was available, and the people tolerated this small carnivore in their midst, simply as a way to control the pests. And then slowly the intimacy of the bond became greater and greater, until finally some selective breeding was engaged upon, in which case you now have the domestic cat. There's nothing difficult to understand about any of that, and I don't think anybody disagrees with it. But you see, when you make a parallel argument for the wolf, it breaks down almost immediately. And that's simply because the wolf is much larger and much more threatening to people than a domestic cat, a wild cat, an ancestral wild cat. And secondly, there's nothing much really that would attract the wolf to an encampment. So you have to establish some compatibility, and then you also have to establish some kind of attractant. And so some kind of jackal-like, smaller, more omnivorous canid than the wolf, which is a specialized carnivorous mammal, unlike other canids. Some of the smaller jackal-like ancestors are much more plausible model, because it would have been attracted to encampments by the merest scraps of bones and other refuse, and most importantly by human feces. The human feces are unpalatable to discuss, but they're vitally important in understanding the initial attractant of this hypothetical extinct jackal-like species to human encampments. So the way it could work is there's a jackal-like species out there with a black and tan coloration, at least partially. It was attracted to human encampments about 30,000 years ago, partly for the human feces. This was convenient, of course, because nobody likes too many feces around. And it also snuffed up some odd bones or whatever, the marrow from which had been extracted. And although that was initially not particularly important to the people did what Aboriginal Australians did before European arrival, which is they would find out where the dens were, and they would steal the puppies, kill and eat some of them, and then the prettiest individuals would be hand-reared as basically pets for the kids. And then when those pets grew up, then the same thing would happen as happened in Aboriginal Australia, which is that the dingo was then allowed to go free and breed in the wild again. So there was no selective breeding, but there was a kind of a drawing closer between canid and human, in the sense that some proportion of the infants were hand-reared and thoroughly habituated to human presence. And so gradually over time, this domestication process could proceed to the point where in the context of towns and agriculture, you could actually confine the animals and tether them and start to breed them selectively into different breeds for different purposes, probably initially watchdogs. Dogs are downright handy as watchdogs, but in order for them to function well in that way, you have to confine them. And Aboriginal Australians never confined the dingo at all, under any circumstance, for 5,000 years. That didn't happen. It was basically a wild animal that was a guest presence, mainly as a pet with Aboriginal Australians.
So is it not conceivable that humans, when they hunted large animals, there was enough meat left behind for it to be worth the wolf's while to come in and try and steal large chunks of meat?
Well, maybe, but you see, if I was a wolf, and bear in mind that in the region where the wolf is hypothesized as having been domesticated, it's an animal somewhat comparable to adult female human size, 40 to 50 kilograms. If I was a wolf in that situation, I wouldn't worry about the offal and the scraps. I'd go for the people, because in Western societies we've been sold two somewhat misleading ideas. Number one is that the domestic dog came mainly from the wolf. Number two is that the wolf is this kind of overly denigrated, rather noble savage type, fairly harmless creature that just wants to live its noble, ecologically sensible life in the wild and doesn't want to be persecuted by us malicious and misunderstanding humans. But as somebody like Valerius Geist, who was a very good Canadian zoologist, pointed out, the wolf is a terrible creature, and all our ancestral human communities knew this very, very well. The wolf is a terrible creature. It's a gregarious, large, carnivorously specialized canid that you want nothing to do with. It's a terrible animal. It's an animal that, in Geist's opinion, was capable of depopulating vast areas of the boreal biome of all big game. So people don't want to be around wolves. We might think that now from our urban intellectual and enlightened perspective, but if you live out there in Siberia, 10,000 years ago, or in the reality of wolf habitat, you want nothing to do with these animals. They are your sworn enemies.
It's a bit like a leopard in an African setting. You are terrified of a leopard, especially at dusk. You do not want to be under a tree.
I would be less terrified of leopards living in the outskirts of Lusaka in Zambia than I would be of wolves living in some medieval community in Germany, because the leopard is mainly after your dog. The leopard is mainly after your dog, right? And if it gets your dog, it gets out of there and it doesn't attack you. The wolf is after you. The wolf is after you because you're better prey than your dog. You're bigger, and it's got the numbers to overpower you. Because the wolf hunts gregariously, whereas the leopard hunts alone. So I think this is an important tangential fact for people to absorb before they start considering who is the real main ancestor of the domestic dog. Is don't think that the wolf is your friend. That's a terrible, terrible mistake.
Why is it in the fairy tales and the various novels, the herdsman, the shepherd looking after the sheep, it's a lone wolf coming to take out the sheep, and it's the shepherd with a catapult that can protect the herd from the lone wolf. The term lone wolf is common in English as well, why haven't we absorbed the fact that actually this creature is terrifying because it comes in numbers to take you out?
Well, there are such things as lone wolves, because the social structure and the population structure of wolves is variable according to circumstances and changes in time. So it's not categorically a false idea.
Yeah.
But it's simultaneously true that the wolf is both big and carnivorous and gregarious.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't, if I was walking home in the medieval era from a friend's place somewhere in eastern Germany, to my home like 10 kilometers away at night, I would not want to run into a lone wolf either, to be honest.
Yeah.
Particularly at night when that animal has the advantage of better vision. Because there's no doubt that a 40 or 50 kilogram wolf, if it's hungry enough, can take down a fully grown man. No problem at all. No problem at all. It just grab you by the leg and then you're gone. It'll do something like it'll mangle your calf muscle or chew through your Achilles heel. And once it gets you down, you're done. It'll just rip out your intestines, and that'll be that.
But it's almost as if we've blocked out this extreme terror of a pack of wolves taking out humans. And that must have happened through time. And we don't have that story in our heads, do we?
Well, we have it at the level of the wolf, the big bad wolf. But as you said, it's usually made out to be a lone animal, which underestimates the terror of it. But we do have it. We have that deep in our culture, but it's been kind of covered over by this more modern, much more fanciful and idealistic view of the wolf as a creature that's been misinterpreted by human bigotry and bias, But as Valerius Geist pointed out, it's the original view that was the more correct one. And so when you understand that, then it's actually quite difficult to come up with a plausible scenario of how the initial attraction happened that went from a big bad wild wolf to a cute little chihuahua. It becomes a much more fanciful notion compared to the alternative, which is that there's some kind of extinct northern jackal out there with a coloration pattern that included the black and tan pattern, and that was the main ancestor, even though nobody's disputing that there is some blood of the wolf in the domestic dog and manifest phenotypically, particularly in certain breeds.
Yeah.
Nobody's denying there's some admixture of the genes of the wolf. And that is completely plausible simply because all members of the genus Canis are interfertile and can hybridize with each other depending on circumstances. So the hypothesis that the main ancestor of the domestic dog is actually some kind of extinct jackal does not exclude accepting that some breeds are partly or largely derived from the wolf.
Yeah. If you think about it in terms of Occam's razor, or the most parsimonious explanation, to think that our mortal enemy turned into our best friend is quite a leap of faith versus a small jackal in the shadows turned into our best friend. That's easier to accept, isn't it?
Yes, that is the big stumbling block. Yeah. It's a bit fanciful.
Yeah, and eating feces. There must be a fair bit of nutrition left in human feces that the ancestral jackal benefited from. But is that quite common in the animal kingdom? Are there jackals today that consume feces? I know feces consumption happens, but how common is it among Canis species today? And then I'd also just note that I think a fair number of domestic dogs do still home in on human feces, much to the disgust of their owners on a walk.
Yes, well, I've never delved into the literature deeply enough to see whether there's any records of wild Canis species eating human feces. I presume it happens, but either it's in a part of the literature that I haven't consulted, or it's been kind of omitted by the literature. But you don't really need to worry about jackals, because there's so many instances of the domestic dog eating human feces that the problem is not the frequency of observation. The problem is that nobody wants to talk about it. That's the problem. But any dog owner who's got experience with the dog will know that the dog is very happy to eat human feces, and the reason that's profitable is simply because the dog's digestive system is more efficient than our own.
Yeah.
So, we produce quite a plump and juicy fecal morsel, but if you look at the corresponding feces of the dog, they're kind of shriveled and spent, and that's because the dog, partly because the dog has a gastrointestinal tract that's adapted to be able to extract even the protein and nourishment from bone. So when a dog eats bone, it doesn't grind it into a fine powder. It consumes it in fairly large chunks after breaking it up with its molars. And then the digestive system is strong enough that it can completely render those bones to nothing but a kind of a whitish powder that comes out in the feces. We humans can't do that. So our human digestive system, more or less like that of the pig, is somewhat inefficient. So we get enough out of our food to run metabolically, but our feces are still rather nutritious, particularly because we have a hindgut fermentation system in the colon in which there's got to be enough nutrition and enough bacterial biomass that you can generate the essential fatty acids, butyric acid, and so on, that colonic system is meant to give us. And so, if you can imagine that there's quite a lot of good stuff sitting in the colon generating essential fatty acids, then what comes out of the rectum is more or less that same stuff. It's still fairly worthwhile. It's got stuff in it. It's got protein, bacterial protein, some undigested material. And so when it comes out, the dog thinks, well, that's not bad. That's not exactly top billing fare, but it's worse than starving. And so the dog will often eat it. Yeah. Now, around any kind of human encampment, even of maybe 3-4 families in the medieval period or 30,000 years ago, there's going to be quite a lot of feces generated because people are just going to walk a little bit out of the camp. That's simply what people did, and then shit in the woods, and coming and eating that brings the jackal to within, say, tens of meters of the people, but doesn't subject it to any particular danger because it can do that at night. And of course, it's convenient for the people. They wouldn't persecute that animal because it's very nice to have your feces cleaned up around your community.
Yeah.
And that is the single most compelling idea of the initial attraction, but also the one that absolutely nobody wants to discuss. And we have to get past that disgust reflex if we want to be objective in our approach to this whole topic.
Yeah, and there's perhaps a psychology of being impressed by domesticating the wolf that we have to overcome as well. So there's some pride that has to be lost as well.
Well, that's a very appropriate point in this at this point in the discussion, because now we can weigh two different things up, one on the left hand and one on the right hand. Okay, which do we humans more gravitate towards subconsciously in our preferred view of the wolf? On the left, you have this mighty carnivore that has been so
preferred view of the dog, of the domestic dog, isn't it?
What did I say? The domestic?
You said the wolf. You said the wolf.
The wolf. Yeah. So on the left, we've got the view of the wolf. No, actually, I am talking about the dog. Okay, I'm saying which view of the domestic dog do people find subconscious or preferable? The view that is this magnificent, noble carnivore out there, which is somewhat human-like in its social complexity and its monogamy and the devotion of the father to the young, in the sense that it's one of the few mammals that have paternal care, but it's fierce and ferocious and warlike, and that it's so much in awe of us that we've managed to sublimate its fierce potential into being our human companion. That's the romantic view of the wolf. So we view the wolf having been domesticated is almost like a tribute to our magnificence. You see?
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, what you've got is a much less preferable model subconsciously, which is, firstly, the ancestor was a mere jackal. Secondly, the basis of attraction was not a respect for our human mastery or our subjugation of its hypercarnivory, but simply a matter of it eating our shit. You see, that view does not sell. But you see, we have to get over that as scientists, because we should never allow those kinds of cultural preferences, even in subconscious form, to affect our objectivity.
You can see how easy it would happen. I mean, the wolf story is so much more attractive, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah,
It's wonderful to think that you've got a wolf at the hearth, as opposed to a shit eater, shit eater at the hearth.
It's just, it's not surprising at all. So, I've been walking around with my dogs in the local forest here, and really enjoying looking at other dogs now, because we've created a new framing here, particularly the black and tan coloration. So if you walk around with this frame, you can actually see the ancestor of the domestic dog. You can see this ancestral jackal quite clearly in many of the dogs that you pass. So it's the pattern is intricate. So should we perhaps try and frame it for the listener, Anthony, as to what one needs to look for when you next go out on a walk in the park?
Well, yes, Anthony, I would love to do that more than anything, but I suspect that we won't be able to do it justice in this particular podcast. So maybe we should just outline it and then attend to that in another podcast,
in
because
part two.
Our
of course.
time today is limited. But just to plant the seed of a search image into people's minds, because it's amazing how little appreciated this black and tan coloration is in the context of the ancestry of the domestic dog. Just to give people a bit of a search image, what the black and tan pattern is it's a perfect wild type pattern, as opposed to the various patterns that have been introduced advertently or inadvertently by anthropogenic selection in the process of domestication. So when your border collie has an asymmetrical white patch on its face, and black pelage over most of its body with occasional sort of white splotches, that's very much a domestic pattern that's completely at odds with any wild type coloration in the family Canidae, and also reveals itself as being artificial in a way because of its asymmetrical distribution from left to right. And we see that kind of domestic pattern in all sorts of domestic animals, including guinea pigs, pigs, and horses and bosts, like Friesland cattle and so on. So we understand that particular kind of pattern. But what's much less easy to understand is that some individuals of the domestic dog across an extremely wide range of breeds of extremely different body sizes, from the Chihuahua upwards, have got this perfect wild type coloration. And that's what we should go into in a subsequent podcast, because when you get your eye in for that, you see it everywhere. And you also see it in what you see is a combination. In many individuals of the domestic dog, you can see a combination of that symmetrical wild type pattern and the blotching overlay of domestication. But what's significant is that the blotches, like the big white patches, the asymmetrical blotches, are never, it's never the case that they are overlain by the black and tan pattern. They always overlay the black and tan pattern. So the black and tan pattern is always the underlying pattern upon which the domestic distortions have been superimposed. So there are various lines of evidence that black and tan pattern is completely wild type. And once you accept that, it becomes very difficult to see the wolf as the main ancestor of the domestic dog, because although the wolf is a widespread animal right across the northern hemisphere in North America and Eurasia, and goes down into the tropics in India, and also into Arabia, there's categorically no population of the wolf that's ever been recorded with a black and tan pattern. So
Right.
there's something. So the very least you have to do if you wish to stick to the wolf the idea that the wolf is the main ancestor is you have to come up with a plausible mechanism whereby a whole perfect, symmetrical, complex, obviously wild type pattern was somehow spirited into existence in the transition from wild wolf to many different breeds of domestic dog. It's highly far-fetched, but maybe somebody can come up with such a scenario.
So we're invoking a jackal-like ancestor that had a black and tan coloration with all this beautiful symmetry, and that's one of the really enjoyable parts of this reframing is just enjoying that aesthetic wonder of this black and tan symmetry across so many different dog breeds. The one thing that puzzles me, Anthony, is why that ancestor is extinct, given how hardy most jackal-like canids are. I'm thinking of the black-backed jackal in South Africa. No matter how much it's persecuted, it bounces back. It's a difficult animal to drive to extinction, but perhaps it just got absorbed into human cultures. Did it just morph into the domestic dog, and that's how it disappeared? I suppose it's totally unknowable, but have you ever given that some thought as to how this extinction might have played out?
Well, I've got two thoughts, and I'll try to be brief and concise. Number one is everybody seems to agree now that the domestic dog, whatever the ancestor of the domestic dog was first domesticated in the Pleistocene, not in the Holocene. So the Holocene goes from 10,000 years ago to the present. This animal was domesticated 30,000 years ago. So for 20,000 years of the Pleistocene, this process was going on. And we know that the changes, the ecological changes in the world towards the end of the Pleistocene and at the beginning of the Holocene were pervasive enough to eliminate whole faunas in the northern hemisphere, and in fact through South America as well. The entire American supercontinent and the whole northern hemisphere were profoundly changed faunistically by the terminal stages of the Pleistocene. And that is when this process was happening. So it could well be that human beings managed to domesticate this wild jackal before it went naturally extinct towards the end of the Pleistocene, simply because all the climatic changes were so profoundly important in affecting all of the faunas in the northern hemisphere. So there is a plausible model for the extinction of this wild jackal, which I've called, by the way, Canis rubro-negrus. Rubro meaning reddish and negrus meaning black and tan. You can regard it as a casualty of the same megafaunal extinctions that wiped out so many different animals in the northern hemisphere and the Americas. But there's another aspect to it, which is that what people don't realize, and again, this is a very unpalatable fact to grok, people don't like, people shy away from this fact, is that there is no more pure species called the wolf. Because all populations, as far as we know of the wolf, have been hybridized to some degree with the domestic dog. And so when you face that fact, and you also face the fact that there's also probably no purebred populations of the coyote anymore in the world, then you start to realize that it's actually quite difficult to draw a clear boundary around a particular species of canis. So what happened was, long ago already, the domestic dog was widespread enough that it started to interbreed with the wolf right across the range of the wolf. And that has kind of polluted, if you like, the genes of all populations of wolves everywhere, although it's only in some populations that actually is manifested phenotypically. And the classic example is Yellowstone, where they reintroduced the wolf, and the wolf is well studied and well photographed. And it's well known that, like perhaps 1 in 10 or maybe 2 in 10 individuals in Yellowstone are pure black. And people think that's the wolf. That's not the wolf. Those are the genes of the domestic dog coming out in the wolf. And so there are no wolves left. You can call them wolves, but genetically speaking, they're all somewhat introgressed with the domestic dog. Similarly, the coyote has suffered an even more profound change, because what happened in the coyote just in the last century is that it's so profoundly interbred with both the wolf and the domestic dog that a whole new species has been created in modern America that is now invading the urban fringes of Los Angeles and New York, and that's called the coy wolf or the coy dog. So you've got a three-way hybrid that's got completely different ecological potential and is so formidable, so cunning, so masterful that it's actually able to meet humans on an urban platform and hold its, So technically speaking, both the coyote and the wolf are extinct. It's just that we have a kind of a taxonomic convention of still calling them coyote and wolf. So it's against, if you take those two factors, the Pleistocene extinctions and the natural hybridization tendency among all species of Canis, then you can easily see how that original jackal, Canis rubro-negrus, might have gone extinct, and its genes survive only in the domestic dog.
It's strange that the black and tan coloration hasn't moved into the coyote and the wolf then. Given
that is a good point. That is a good point. Yes, that is a very good point. But the black aspect of the dog has moved into the wolf. Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thanks, Anthony. We'll have to have a part 2 to discuss the coloration at length and all the beautiful nuances. And perhaps what we can do for listeners is, for that part 2, we'll have some photographs of the black and tan coloration so that they can look at that dog coloration while we talk through it.
Well, that's right. And as a parting idea, dear listeners who have dogs as intimate family members, you can look at your dog as an anthropogenic creation and enjoy all its fancy domestic patterns, but you can also look at it as a wild animal in the same kind of a lens as gazelles and other beautiful symmetrical wild animals with elaborate markings. And when you look at them in that latter framework, you might find yourself surprisingly appreciative of the beautiful wild appearance of an animal like a kelpie. An animal like a kelpie, I put it to you, is a throwback to 30,000 years ago, giving you a window on a beautiful, elaborately colored wild animal that's now your best friend, sleeps on your bed and acts like a human being, but retains the full appearance of its completely wild, naturally colored ancestor. And isn't that a magnificent thought?
Yeah, wonderful. Dobermans as well. What other breeds could we?
Well, the Doberman and the Doberman and a few other breeds, Rottweiler and so on, are exclusively black and tan.
Yeah.
But there are many other breeds, including miniature schnauzers, dachshunds, some Chihuahua varieties that are often black and tan.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things about the black and tan pattern is that it has been retained in its wild form, despite the almost incredible modification of the body proportions and body size of the breeds concerned. I mean, this is a really boggling thing, that an animal as modified as a dachshund or a miniature terrier still retains the full ancestral coloration of an animal that went extinct in the Pleistocene. A magnificent thought indeed, and completely, way underplayed in scientific thinking about this whole topic.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and looking forward to part 2.
Yes, to listeners, thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share, and we look forward to discussing the black and tan coloration of the domestic dog in our next podcast. And over and out from us for now.
Ciao.